Hi, I'm Catherin Keller, and I teach theology at Xavier University in Cincinnati, Ohio. And I wanted to reflect a little today about process thought and the issue of our sex identity, our gender, and how process thought, which is very important to me as a basic vision of the whole universe, ties into some of the very nitty-gritty psychological and sociological and political issues that have come up in the last couple of decades through the women's movement. We started to question again what our gender means. We've started to doubt that some of the old roles really let us be the full people that we have the potential to be. And that's brought a lot of crisis out, and yet it's also, like any crisis, brought into play a whole lot of opportunity, a sense of something really new being possible. And my basic belief is that, in fact, the women's movement has brought into play possibilities which maybe give us more reason for hope and more reason for excitement about the future than any other movement at all. And yet, really, I probably had been thinking about process theology for just as long a time as I've been thinking about feminist issues, which were in the air by the time I went to college in the late 60s, very much in the air. My sense is that what process theology has to offer and what feminism has to offer are incredibly closely connected. And let me say a few things about that. There's a psychologist named Nancy Chodorow who suggests that in our culture, men have been brought up very differently than women. And she's not just talking about roles anymore. I mean, we all know about boys being brought up to play with little guns, and that maybe produces militarism, and they're brought up not to cry, and that represses their feelings. That's all really important, where women are brought up playing with dolls, and that conditions them to want to be mothers and housewives. Those are very important issues. But Chodorow suggests that some deeper things are also going on in the processes that go on in our family situations that bring about our sense of who we are as men and who we are as women. What she says about the bringing up of men is that because they, like women, identify with their mothers as the primary parent in our culture, because it's the mother, so far, who in most situations is very much the primary parent in those early formative years. Because of that, men, or I should say little boys, at a certain age, 3, 4, 5, suddenly are brought into a traumatic situation because they start realizing that they can't identify with their mothers anymore, that they're not women. They start realizing that very clearly, and the message they get is that they have to identify with their fathers. Well, they love their fathers, they idealize their fathers, but if their fathers have not been fully and intimately involved in being parents, then they don't really know their fathers the same way they know their mothers. And so their identity is going to be very difficult. It's going to be based more on separating from their mothers than it is from really fully having a sense of what it is to be men. And they're going to have a lot of stock maybe in getting a sense of the power of being a man because they don't really have an inner feel for that. And that sense of disconnecting from the mother, that's going to be very primary. Well, that's that part of the theory. The theory is that little girls, on the other hand, never really stop identifying with their mothers. And that causes its own problems down the line. It's hard for us to get a real sense of ourselves as individuals, as women, and yet we do have this primary sense of empathy and connectedness with the mother that little boys had to interrupt drastically. So that little boys grow up, she says, with a sense of being separate selves. And little girls, she says, will grow up with much more of a sense of being relational selves. That is, of being very interconnected with others. And there are disadvantages for both and advantages in both. Little boys maybe have more freedom to be individuals. Little girls have more relational, empathetic capacities. Little boys, on the other hand, might be individuals without relatedness, very isolated, and then perhaps very control-oriented. Whereas little girls are going to have more fluid ego boundaries and yet they're going to have a harder time expressing and asserting their individuality. Well, that ties very deeply into process thought in ways that perhaps you can guess, because the sense of being relational selves, oddly enough, is really right at the heart of the process intuition about what we are. That is, our individuality is very relational. And yet being relational doesn't mean giving up our individuality. And so if from process thought we gain this sense that everything is connected with everything else, the question is, all right, that's a good theory, but how do we connect to that? How do I feel that? And it's interesting that process thought's been so appealing to so many women, because Chatter's psychological theory would suggest that women in our culture haven't had to suppress or repress their sense of interconnectedness nearly as much as men have had to do it. Maybe men are attracted to process thought because that's a way for them to heal that basic brokenness that this culture has indirectly and directly imposed on men, a sense of getting connected again for men, whereas for women there's a sense of a way that we can really affirm ourselves as individuals in our connectedness rather than letting our connections be a mode of oppression. Since for women, so often connection has meant a very tight, closed, private, merely domestic network of connections. We haven't really had the sense of a wide public world of interconnectedness. And so maybe women can find that our basic relational sense is affirmed by process thought, but that can now begin to empower us, begin to lead us out into the world, into a wider world of connections and influences and feelings and ideas than we've had access to. But I said at the beginning that there's real hope for the world in this. It's not just a matter of psychological self-realization that I'm talking about, and it's not just a matter of sexual equality. It's rather maybe through getting in touch with these psychological gender issues that something else begins to happen, that we rehearse a whole different way of being in the world. And that is really hopeful, because we live in an age in which the atom has been exploded. And I mean that not just here to bring into our awareness again that really ominous nuclear threat which hangs over our head, but to let that be a metaphor. What does it mean that the atom has been exploded, has been shattered? The integrity of the separate Newtonian atom is what's been exploded in this century. And so far, that seems surely destructive, and everyone is very scared, rightly scared. But something else is possible, maybe, in that sense that the hard boundaries of the nucleus, the hard boundaries of the atom no longer hold. Rather, the atom itself is understood to be open, to be emerging, to be something that's not just separate and the same as itself and enduring and hard and impenetrable and indestructible as the older modern physics would have had us believe. Rather, the atom's not at all indestructible. It's not permanent. It's not hard. It's not this solid, hard ball, which I think we've modeled ourselves after. So maybe the shattering of the old atom is in an odd way like the death of the old Adam, to draw a theological analogy here. So what's the new atom? The new Adam, meaning here not man anymore, but humanity in the fullest sense, is this atom that is our interconnectedness with everything. Every atom, every electron, every nucleus is, we learn from process thought and we learn from the new physics, a kind of energy pulse that's dancing in a complex choreography with the whole universe. And so perhaps the shattering of the boundaries of the ego, if we can tune into that in an excited and affirmative way, lets us begin to feel our interconnectedness with everything else. And oddly, this different cosmology, this different view of the universe, is fitting with the intuitions of feminism. It's fitting with the sense that everything is interconnected. And instead of being afraid of that and threatening to just end all reality because the myth of the separate self and the myth of the Newtonian atom, the myth that everything is separate, no longer holds, instead of blowing up everything and not wanting to live at all because our separateness as individuals, our separateness as nations, our separateness as beings is no longer viable. We now sense that our interconnectedness is something we have to realize and something we have to affirm, something we have to celebrate. Of course, things that are repressed, we learn from psychology, things that are stifled become very negative. And so if this basic interconnectedness goes on being stifled, well, it's going to be incredibly destructive too. That's very concrete. Now with the nuclear threat, we have the threat of what's called mutually assured destruction. MAD are the appropriate initials for those words. Mutually assured destruction. That is what happens when we repress and make very negative interconnectedness. We can experience our interconnectedness as the interconnectedness of total destruction, or we can experience our interconnectedness as something healing, something energizing, something that binds and celebrates. So it seems to me we really have here two alternatives. We can go on denying the way that we're all interrelated and the way that we're related to each other and the way we're related to all races and to all peoples and to all nations and finally to the whole galaxy. We can deny that and hide in our individualist isolation, but by denying that, we're turning the force of interconnectedness into something demonic. And it'll reveal itself then in a very destructive way. It'll reveal itself in the madness of mutually assured destruction or in some other form of planetary disaster or in the gradual downgoing of our whole ecosystem, which is going down because we're failing to realize our interconnectedness with the creatures and with the earth and with all things that grow and with all peoples and with the different economic systems. We fail to reach cooperation because we fail to realize that interconnectedness is the fundamental truth about the universe. Well, that's one possibility, to just go on repressing the fact that we're all interdependent and therefore to experience interdependence as a force of annihilation. The other possibility is to affirm it as something beautiful, something energizing, something a lot like the energy that we experience now only negatively by the release of the boundaries of the atom. We know that that's very energetic, and we've experienced that energy as negative. But to tap into that energy here through ourselves, through our relationships, through cultural interrelationships, through global cooperation, to tap into that interconnectedness as a positive force, as a celebration, and finally as a kind of liturgy of the love of God, as a kind of choreography that extends through all of reality, to experience our interconnectedness in that way, which I think we'll do only when we start healing our relations as men and women. If we can do that, well then, there'll be a lot of positive energy released for the tasks that really matter, the tasks that are urgently at hand. And so you can see that finally, for me, feminism is no special issue. It's no particular concern of one, group of middle-class white career women. Not at all. For me, feminism is just one essential, privileged way in to this fundamental issue about survival and the love of our planet, the love of creation, the love of God. And I guess the way process thought helps us to interconnect different areas of interest like that, is key. It shows again that process thought is really about the relationships between all things. Thanks.